Hello, so it's been quite a long time since I actually did any videos, and with me having released a collection of 12 games that I made last year, with me releasing that a few days ago, this seemed like the ideal time to actually do one. And so I wanted to do a bit of a video talking a bit about how I actually went about designing and developing the games, the kinds of things I learned along the way, and a bit of sort of behind the scenes look at how the stuff actually worked in some cases. So some background for this project. So not long after the Global Game Jam in 2019, really I recognized that I was tending to overscope a lot with the project. So I had ones that, I'd come up with these ideas that I really wanted to make, but the ideas would be huge in scope and they'd take a very long time for actually, developing or delivering, which meant either they take a long time or they'd end up not getting done, and that was not really sort of fun. So a friend suggested forcing myself to make really small sort of short games. And so that's what this collection came out of. So the initial prompt that I had for this was I wanted to set myself the rules of each game I had 20 hours for working on it. And that 20 hours covered everything. So the design, uploading to itch.io, setting up that page, the actual programming, any asset work, every single bit. If I had a setup where it meant that it would take 5 hours to build lighting for it, then that would cost me 5 hours. So I had to be efficient and judicious with my time. So the goal was I'd have 20 hours, and at the end of that, had to be uploaded, ready to release on itch. Then once I'd done all of them, I was allowed up to another 4 hours per game to actually go and do final polishing, fixes, and improvement. And then once that's done for all of them, then I can release them. And so a few days ago, that's what happened. I released them. So that was the rules I was working under, and that's worked really well. So I want to have a look at the different games and sort of how I approach them. So let's take a look at the first game. So this was the very first one, and this one was really happy with. So the prompt with this one was, as long as we'll have each other, we'll never run out of problems. And very early on, my mind immediately went to that being something based upon math problems and working with that. So what I ended up doing was this game, Cat Maths. And so the idea was going to be that you're solving problems, and I needed to have something that the problems were heading to you, being thrown at you. And I don't even remember why I actually wanted it to be a cat from the beginning, but very early on, that was what I wanted. I wanted it to be a cat, and that was going to be who was throwing the problems at you. But then that introduced its own problem in then I needed a cat for the game. And that was not going to be doable because 3D modeling and animation, rigging, anything like that, those are not my area. So that would have been very challenging. I did have a bit of a look to see if I could find a fully rigged and animated cat asset, but that was just not going to be, I couldn't find one that was sort of working for it. And then I had this idea of, well, what if the cat was in a box? And then so naturally, the cat ended up being called Schrodinger. This one, the idea came together quite easily for it, and I set up this system for generating these math problems, and it scales kind of infinitely. Now, it pretty rapidly gets quite challenging because the amount of time you get is progressively less and less, and the numbers that you're working with, progressively it's able to get to the point where they have double digits and everything like that. Now, I had to have some constraints here because I wanted to keep it that it was only integer maths, which meant that I could have made it work with doing division, but I decided actually to just keep it to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and also having brackets in there as well, parentheses. And that sort of worked out to allow me to keep it all integer maths, to make it easily solvable, and that I was pretty happy with. Now, one of the things with this was I wanted to have some level of player training in there, and I was honestly short of time, so I went for the sort of poster approach. Now, the thing that you're about to see at the moment is when Schrodinger gets upset to the point where Schrodinger's done with you not managing to solve the problems, they run very, very rapidly off of the screen. This wasn't actually originally a planned thing. I hadn't actually at that point in time worked out what was going to happen when you reach the stage of Schrodinger being at the maximum frustration, what essentially the fail state was. And it only was because I had a bug in how I was actually moving Schrodinger from position to position that the result of that bug ended up actually turning into what I wanted for the exit behavior, which you'll be about to see in a moment, where Schrodinger reaches maximum frustration and then just races really, really quickly off the screen. Like that. So that was actually not an intentional thing. That wasn't something I'd planned in terms of how I wanted it. It was just a happy accident from a bug that there happened to be in the game, which worked out in the end quite fortunately. So this project worked out quite well. I was really happy with sort of the setup for how the UI and everything behaved in it. One of the things that definitely was a bit frustrated with was the lighting. I never really got the lighting looking quite the way that I wanted to, and I needed to definitely spend a bit more sort of time on that. I think I was going a little bit too complex with how I had the lighting set up, and I think if I was doing it again, I would actually simplify it down to just having a single sort of directional light, and then those ceiling lights that you see, which if I exit back we'll be able to see those ceiling lights, just have those being an emissive texture. I think doing that with then a bit of post-processing would have made a scene that sort of blended a lot nicer. So yeah, but overall this one worked quite well. The setup in terms of the math problems worked quite well. It was able to scale up to quite a good level, and weirdly, as you can kind of see the scene view here, when I updated it to the latest Unity version, something kind of broke in terms of having accented characters, because up until that point I'd been able to have my scripts and Schrodinger was actually with the O with the umlaut over it. And then I upgraded Unity version and that all broke. Hindsight, probably shouldn't have been using class names and file names that had umlauts and so forth in them, but it worked up until the latest version. Not really sure why it broke in the latest version, but something about the 2019.2.12 meant that it kind of did break. But so this was cat maths. So let's now move on to the second game. So this was the second game that made Closing Down, and I learned a lot from this one. One of the big things learned from this one was the importance of planning, and actually planning properly, because this one, so cat maths, I'd done some very, very basic planning, but not a huge amount. Not the amount that I needed. If I'd done more planning, I would have actually been able to, I think, have more time to fix up some of the bits like the environment. This one I did no planning, and the problem there was that with this one, I developed this whole complex setup for the dialogue, and I put together this intricate dialogue system that had all the ability for conditionals, so different states of things could be able to, they could allow some dialogue to happen, and other things could suppress certain dialogue from happening, and it had a limited memory there, and it had this quite complicated setup, because the idea was, I wanted to have things like the shopkeeper being able to get more frustrated as you were rude to them. The shopkeeper, I wanted them to be able to remember if you had said something. So if you repeated the same thing, that the shopkeeper would start to get suspicious and think things were odd. And so that was the plan. And I didn't do any planning, though, that was sort of better to say that was the goal. There was no actual plan for then developing the system. So I spent, a couple of hours building this intricate system, getting it all populated with all of the data, everything like of that, and then I went to use it. And nothing was behaving the way that I wanted it to. Nothing was working the way that it was supposed to, and was debugging for hours. And it took me a while to realize that the system was actually doing everything that I had coded it to properly. There was no code errors, there was no logic bugs, anything like that. It was actually working perfectly. But what it implemented hadn't actually been what I needed, and that happened because I didn't do my planning. And yeah, it cost me, ended up costing me to get it even to vaguely doing what I needed to. That whole dialogue system set up cost me about 5 to 6 hours. So a huge chunk of my development time. And I think if I'd done the actual planning for it, it would have been half that, most likely much less. So this one really didn't sort of work out the way that I wanted. I also spent a lot of time setting up this system so that the characters, the visual appearance, this is actually done by shaders. The actual characters themselves have, you know, all of these different components, and each component has a vertex color assigned to it. And then that vertex color turns into a actual randomly rolled color. So I did this ridiculous setup so it was able to be changing hair color and clothing and like sleeve color and skin color, and I didn't need all of that. I don't know. I mean, it was one of those things where it was cool to see it working, but I didn't need all of that. It was really sort of overdone in terms of that. And so that was one of the big things that I learned from this one, was I went into it without actually planning, without actually scoping stuff properly, and as a result, I spent a lot of time on things that didn't matter, like, you know, really detailed system that allowed me to generate huge numbers of characters when I only needed 3. And then also spent then a huge amount of time on implementing a system that didn't do what I actually needed it to. So this one, in the end, I'm kind of happy-ish with it, but mostly I'm happy with it from the point of view of how it actually looks. You know, the lighting and things like that in the scene, I managed to get this really nice sort of warm glow that I really liked. It set a really good tone for it, but in terms of the actual gameplay and that, yeah, not really happy with it. Hindsight would have just had a single model for each character, would have allowed me to spend more time on making each one look better and having each one be animated and things like that. I also would have absolutely done planning of the technical design. That was very silly of me to not do that. But I did learn my lesson from it, which we'll be able to see in the next project. So let's go and take a look at the third game. Okay, so this is the third game, and this one I did actually learn a lot from the previous one and did make an effort to not repeat my previous mistakes. So the idea for this one, this was based off of the extinction prompt, and originally this was actually not the game that I first was thinking of. What I was first thinking of was you would be in this sort of like a lake surrounded by mountains, and the inspiration there, I think, was from having previously visited Lake Eacham up near Cairns, or near Atherton Tablelands. That was sort of my inspiration, was this huge lake surrounded by, you know, forest and hills and mountains around it. And what it was going to be was you were going to be repairing the ecosystem, so cleaning things up and basically building up the sort of food and plant webs there. But one of the things that I tried with the games, and this was the thing I learned from the closing down one, was trying to make sure I've got a really good picture in my head of how it plays out. And I always try to be in a position where I can actually play the game in my head. And if I can play it in my head, then I find that means I've sort of got a good sense of how to then turn that into the actual plan and the design for it. And every time I was thinking with the extinction one, it just was never really sort of working, and it wasn't sort of feeling like something that was going to be compelling or interesting to be doing. And then I got the idea of it just sort of came to me of doing this sort of more horror game, and in particular the part that came to me from that was what I actually do with the sound emitters here. So one of the things with how the sound works in this is there is actually, surrounding the player, a cloud of sound emitters, which we can see here. And when we're actually playing, those sound emitters are moving. You can see during daytime, those sound emitters are slowly orbiting the player, so they move in and out a bit as well. So they're moving in and out, and they're slowly rotating, and the different layers of it. So there's ones that are above the player, ones that are around sort of the player's height, and ones that are below them. And so they are slowly rotating and then moving in and out. So they're the actual sound sources. So none of the sound sources are tied to a particular location in the environment. And then this is what it's doing during daytime. But when it gets to nighttime, those sound emitters, as well as switching out the set of sounds that they actually use, they start moving much more rapidly. So they rotate around the player faster, they move in and out faster. The idea being to really try and use audio to create that fear for the player. Because with this, it's one of those things where I did consider sort of having an actual, some form of entity that you see that's actually the terror here. And it just, it's one of those things that, obviously from an art point of view, it's not something I felt I would have been able to create. It's also, I feel like if you ever saw the monster, or monsters, it's not just one thing in this, because the actual conceit was that all of the life that comes out at nighttime is going to kill you. It doesn't matter which one, what sort of type of creature it is, all of them are going to try and kill you. And I didn't feel that having any visible creatures would do it justice, and I also feel like the unknown can actually be a lot more scary. If you never see the creature, then you never are going to know where it's sort of coming from. And I think anything I showed would have been a disappointment there. So now that it's reaching nighttime, the emitters are able to sort of cluster in a lot closer. And one of the other things I did with audio, because I said I really wanted to use the audio, there we go. Now it's kicked over to nighttime, and you can see they move very rapidly. They dart in really close, so that those sounds can be coming from right behind you, and then move rapidly away. So I was really wanting to use audio to essentially terrify the living hell out of the player. And I wanted it to be one where it was really tightly balanced as well with how long you actually had. And it's very much the case that you don't actually have much of a margin of error. It is possible to get back to the beacon in time, but it is very challenging to do so, because there's pretty much just enough light globes to actually get there, but not much of a margin of error. Now, one of the things that did with this is, so there is a single path that you can go along. And the way that I actually set this out was I built this environment using Gaia and then some custom modifications to the areas to sort of sculpt and shape things the way that I needed. What I did was I picked a starting location that had a really nice sort of view out like this, and I picked an end location that was a bit more closed in, and then I picked a couple of key points along the way, and then what I did is I actually played it and then moved through it. And then I had a system, which you can see these green markers. What I did was I recorded my path as I moved through. So not just where I was, but how long it had taken me to get there. So I used that to balance the amount of light globes that you get access to. And also, once I had these marked in, I then painted in the path alongside that, cleared out the trees and vegetation in those areas. So it was a case of build the environment, then work out how I, as a player, looking at that environment, would want to move through it, and then added in stuff to guide people more along that path. And that I feel sort of worked out really well. I'm really happy with how that tended to go. Challenge that I had though was then, well, what if people want to go way off the path? So as much as I hate them, I set up invisible walls around the environment so you can't get out of the map. But I wanted more than just that. So what I did is, because my system's there controlling how the time of day goes, so as soon as you're more than a certain distance off of the path, which from memory I set it to be something like around 50 meters off the path. Once you're more than 50 meters off of the path, if it's daytime, then time moves 25% faster. But if it's nighttime, then time moves 25% slower. So if you go off the path, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. And the path is intentionally not easy to sort of find. So this one, really happy with how it all worked out. It came together really well. Now, it actually changed quite a bit when I got to the polish phase, because how it looks now here with the much warmer color palette, and it looks so much better. This isn't how it actually was originally looking. So if I go and find my earlier screenshots, because I kept them, this is actually how it originally looked. So it was a much more, it wasn't as warm a color palette, it was a bit more of a neutral tone. And it didn't really sort of work, because I wanted it to have this really warm tone, because the daytime should feel like a calm, peaceful, relaxing summer's day. It should feel like a really nice environment. It should feel really comfortable. And then when it gets to nighttime, it should feel terrifying. That was sort of the goal. And when I was doing my final testing with it, I intentionally went off of the path, and yeah, I wasn't a fan. It was terrifying, which was good. My own game is managing to make me start to be a bit terrified, and it's doing what I want. Really happy with how this one worked out, and this was one where I did a lot of planning, and that planning paid off. It's something that the final outcome actually lined up really closely with my vision of what I wanted it to look like. Okay, so this was the fourth game, which this one had the prompt an image of Ouroboros, which is a bit more of a challenging one in some ways. So an Ouroboros is the symbol that we can see here with the snake eating its tail. And so this one, I looked into the meaning behind the symbol and how it had been used. And initially, what I was thinking of for the game was it was going to be one where it was always going to be in this room, but you're changing age. And I was not sure if it was going to be a case of growing up or if you were going to be getting younger. I wasn't really sure how I wanted it to be happening, but I wanted you to be sort of trapped in this room and completing these cycles. And then I wanted you to have these terminals that you're interacting with. But the age changing didn't really feel like it worked. And so I decided, if I'm already going to go and have these cycles and have these changes happening, why not have it be different people? And that might actually work better with the sort of plot. And so what we see is how the story unfolds is, early on, people are getting admitted for sort of more critical reasons. And over time, those admissions become for less and less serious reasons, and they become for quite minor ones. Which the idea of going in for something like a paper cut and you have been then unconscious is intended to be quite weird and strange. And the messages that you see in the terminal also change over time. So early on, those messages are referring to, when they're talking about announcements from Ouroboros, it's always there's a certain person. There's people from Ouroboros making those announcements, but over time, that fades away. And it's just, well, there's been an announcement from Ouroboros, not this particular person presented it. And that's because Ouroboros is eating people. That's essentially it. I don't know how or why it's doing that, but I know that without eating people, Ouroboros dies. I don't know whether Ouroboros is a person. I have a feeling like not. It's kind of like the machine is eating people, is how it is sort of, if I was doing more on this and you actually got to see more of that, that's actually what it would be the machine is eating people. And so by you completing the cycle, you are actually feeding Ouroboros. So this was one where I had the challenge of what I wanted was the only way to win is to do nothing. So if you stand there and do nothing in the game, and I wanted to eventually be able to be prompting people on that, so you do eventually get a message that tells you to do that, but you can actually win the game at this initial point, because you just need to sit here and do nothing for a few minutes, And what you'll see is over time, the lights get dimmer, Ouroboros gets more insistent, and the logo itself actually changes as well. The logo gets more red and more corrupted looking. And Ouroboros is starting to, get cranky at you and say all of these things to try and encourage you or force you to do the treatment. And so you just have to ignore that. And I really like that idea of a game where the way you win it, the way you complete it, is you don't play. Because as long as you're completing cycles, it resets. It'll keep generating new patient bios, things like that, but it resets. So you have to sit there and do nothing. I was really happy with how that worked out. It ended up being a lot of fun. And I liked it from the point of view of its subverted expectations of what you expect to have happen. Traditionally in a lot of games like this, you would break out and then there would be this whole progression as you would get there and you would tear down the machine. And I didn't want that. Firstly, given the constraint of 24 hours, it was not going to be doable in time. But I actually like the idea of it being something different, of it being the complete opposite to what we normally expect to have happen. As we can see, it's already starting to get darker. The logo is starting to change. That corruption is starting to seep in. Now, these screens are a particularly interesting thing. So a lot of cases in the past when I've done screens like that, I've done them as world space UI. So world space UI, and then you're interacting with them. That's actually not what these are done as, and I intentionally didn't do them as that because I wanted these. I wanted to be able to apply a lot of effects to these, and it was much easier for me to do that if these were actually essentially a render to texture setup. So if we look at the level, what we have is we have the actual player environment here, and then over here we have one of our stages. So I set up these little environments so we actually have a couple of stages, and this is obviously one of them. So here we have our second screen, and our terminal one is located, for whatever reason I put it way up over there. I don't know why I put it there. But essentially I set up these little stages. So how the stages work is that we actually have, and if I go over to this particular stage, we can see it. So it is a set of world space UI. So I created these sets. So there's the world space UI for this one, and then world space UI for the actual logo, and there's just a camera pointing at it. So you just have a camera pointing at it. They have their own post-processing volume, so I can do my own customization of the effects for each one. It allows me to then easily do the corruption stuff. And honestly, just such an easy setup. The trickiest thing I had to do with that was obviously this screen, you can interact with it. So what that meant was I needed to have a UI redirection logic. So there's actually a little bit of logic on these, a UI redirector. So clicking on anywhere here actually just sends those through as a normal key press or as a normal input to the actual UI that I've got set up for it. Which meant I didn't need to do a whole bunch of custom handling for how that UI worked. I was able to just have it use all of the normal Unity events for clicking on things. Super happy with how it ended up working out. So yeah, this one, the big things I'd say as takeaways from this one were that really careful planning and iterating on the idea till I had one that just sort of really locked in terms of being able to visualize how it played out. And then in terms of sort of little tricks point of view, when you've got to do things like screens, when you've got to do like security cameras, anything like of that, look at doing render to texture and then putting that texture on something, because it allows you to just to do those screen effects. I could have, if I'd done it any other way, I would have needed to do a bunch of shader work typically, whereas with this, it's a post-processing effect, and I can just add one in or remove it or ramp one up. Much easier way of working it. So yeah, this one, super happy with how it worked out. Alright, so this was the fifth one. So this was more challenging one to actually do, mostly because of the material. So this is one I've been wanting to make for a while, because it's a personal game about my experience. And I've been wanting to make it for a while, mostly because games for me are a bit of a way of actually sort of processing stuff. And so this was one where I really wanted to be doing that, and the idea I iterated on for a while. The intent was really that you were going to be doing these very mundane tasks, because the mundane tasks are kind of the point. You're doing very mundane, very simple tasks, and really the central thing is just those words falling apart. Things falling to pieces was really pretty much the big sort of theme from this. And so this one, it was fairly straightforward to make. It's the one that had the least amount of time. Part of that is that it's one where it's obviously a more challenging one for me working with it. In particular, recording the dialogue was a challenge. And so that made it more difficult to work with. And it's also one where I was very, very cautious about adding too much. It's very easy to add too much to a game and add so much that you actually take away from things. And so with this, I felt that it was very minimalist, and I wanted it to stay very minimalist. The main sort of changes I made when it came to polish were things like the dirt shader I did for a later game I brought over to this one. And I had considered early on with the text having it be the very kinetic text style of thing used in What Remains of Edith Finch. And that was absolutely a touchstone and inspiration for this. And so one of the things that does is that the text animates in a lot of different ways. And I considered doing that. It was obviously going to be technically very challenging to do that and to do that well. And I wasn't convinced that it would add anything to it. That was the big thing with it. So I really didn't feel like it would actually add anything to it. And so rather than forcing something in that I felt, while it might look cool, wouldn't add to the story and could actually take away from it, I sort of went just for this very minimalist approach. So all it is that each letter gets a rigid body attached to it and has a time delay for when it falls. And they're just physics objects. And that sort of worked out really well for creating this effect of just having these things fall to pieces, and that's really what this is about. This game is about that idea of when you're falling to pieces and you're finding solace in those mundane, mechanical, boring tasks, those things that occupy you somewhat and keep you busy. And try and it's really what it comes down to. So yeah, this one as I said, it was a challenging one. It's one that I've been wanting to make for a while and been sort of holding off because I really hadn't felt I was in the right headspace to actually making it. And then I finally got to a point where I felt like I was going to be okay to make it. And it was tough, but it turned out it's how I wanted. It's a very short one. It's this small sort of moment, and that's really what it's about. Okay, so this one, yeah, I learned some really key things from this one, and one of the big things I learned from it was not trying to do an idea when the idea is just not working out. So as I said, I try to always make sure that I can picture the idea in my head. I like to be able to picture what the environment looks like, what it looks like from different angles, what it looks like as you're moving through it, and sort of those interactions, those behaviors that you're engaging in as you move through it. And if I can't picture that, then it's generally not going to work. The game's not going to play out how I wanted it to, and it's not going to be good. And that's usually my signal to, okay, I need to put a hold on this idea and look at and see other ideas, other avenues to pursue. this one I didn't do that, and I think this was done at a time when I was really busy and really stressed, and that doesn't make for good creativity. So I kept trying to force the same gameplay of this aspect, and the aspect I really liked from the gameplay was this idea of you inspiring others to join you and fight back against sort of this oppression of people. And I really liked that concept, but I kept trying to find settings and environments, and I toyed around with the idea of a futuristic environment, toyed around with sort of more like contemporary ones, and before finally settling on this sort of medieval style one. But it just, in every case, it was trying to force this system into it, and it didn't work out. And even though this was one that was planned, that plan was kind of inherently flawed because I wasn't convinced myself that this game would work. And it's probably one of the weakest ones of the set because of that fact that I took that gameplay and just kept trying to find a setting where it fit just enough and ended up forcing that into it. And that's really sort of the big takeaway from this. And even from a tech implementation, I made some questionable choices. I implemented my own AI for the characters. I've got an AI background, but still, that means I've even less excuse for going and implementing all of the complex setup because I should have known better. Because I would know that, getting stuff like what old mate Purple's doing there, I should have known, and I didn't think of it. And this was something where I also went for a really complicated setup, in that there's a lot of common code between the player and the AI characters, to the extent that the player character essentially can just go and possess any of the characters. You can switch at any point in time, camera moves, everything like that. I didn't need that setup, but because I had it so sort of rigidly stuck in my head of how I was trying to force the gameplay through, I stuck with that, and it really didn't work. And so I spent a lot of time making this area and setting up all this logic for the AI and everything, and it just ultimately didn't sort of convey what I wanted it to, which was this idea of community. You inspiring community to rally together, to rise up and to oppose oppression. And it didn't end up delivering on that. So I think the big thing I learned from this was recognizing when an idea just sucks, kind of, and not forcing implementation of an idea that's just not working. That was that's why this sort of didn't hit the mark. It's because I tried to force the gameplay that I had locked in my head and just basically shoehorned it in the setting that it managed to work in the most, which wasn't the best setting, and it might have been just a case of what I actually needed to do was throw out the gameplay setting, because the setting ultimately wasn't the issue, it was the gameplay there. And so I think that's a big thing to recognize, and that's certainly my takeaway that I learned from this. And I think that shows through in the later ones that I made, was this big thing of, if I can't play the game in my head, and if what I'm playing in my head isn't engaging and isn't fun, and I don't find myself going back to it and just keep running through that, I need to at least not necessarily throw the idea out, but pause it and look at other options. And that's what I should have done with this one. But then I did take that lesson and carry that through over into the next ones, and the next ones much more hit the mark in comparison to this one. Speaking of the next ones, let's take a look at them. Alright, so over to the 7th game. So I said I learned my lesson from the previous one, and I did. This one, the idea, I iterated on it for a while, and eventually, because the prompt was we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And I messed around with a lot of different ideas for this one, of trying to get something that worked well. Originally I was actually looking at, not necessarily a puzzle game, but actually kind of a free-form sort of just experiential game, just an explore one. And the idea was that I was looking at was going to be you could play as either a And this is going to be as either a sphere, a cube, or something else. And the idea there would be that depending on which one you were, you would see, you'd be in the same room, but you would see the room differently. So a sphere would see areas that they'd be able to move through, that they'd be able to roll along. So there's going to be different sort of movement styles and different versions of what people could see based upon who they were. And I like that idea, but it was, and it might be one that I revisit, but it was never sort of really locking in for me in terms of it being a sort of solid idea. But I like this idea of viewing the world differently and doing different visual effects. And so then that led into this idea of, well, what if the world somehow got fractured? And that fracturing resulted in changing our perceptions of the world, and people could be actually trapped in those different sort of almost segments of the color spectrum. And so that's how Fragments came to be. And so I did a lot of planning in terms of the layout for the maps for this, mostly because I wanted to have spaces that sort of scaled up in size and also had a certain sort of feel to them. I think in hindsight I'd probably lay out the spaces differently and try and make it feel a bit more like the sort of research lab. At the moment it feels, I don't know, the space doesn't feel quite like how I would have liked it to, ideally, but it's not terrible. I messed around a lot with the phrasing on these as well. So very intentionally here, the phrasing of these early ones is that you're letting the fragment merge with you, that it's becoming part of you. Whereas the final one actually is you merging with the fragment. And so this was a lot of fun actually. Like there was a lot of stuff was setting up in terms of creating these little data pads, which I absolutely just reused the model and tech from the whatever happened to Survey Team 4. So that was sort of a massive time saver. I think one of the things that I wish, and just wasn't possible with time, there wasn't any areas that sort of went wrong with planning. It was just, there was a lot to lay out. Like this level is quite large. You know, there's a lot to it. If we take a look at the scene view, and then we look at just the actual size and scale of this, it's a lot. And I very much wanted to have the aspects that are in here now of these doors that appear and disappear, and that as you absorb these fragments you can see more of the world and you start to see color. I really wanted more variation in the things that you see in these areas, and I wanted to have there be more sort of a purpose to the actual objects that you're seeing in the room. At the moment there's not really a purpose to them, and I would have liked there to be an actual purpose to them to have a role, them to have a particular fit within the narrative. At the moment they they don't. That's the reality of it. They don't actually have sort of a purpose and a role to any great extent. So that's something that definitely would want to work on. And this is actually one of the ones that I'm considering revisiting, because I really like the idea behind this, of this sort of fractured reality. And I like this idea that you are working to repair that fractured reality, but that ultimately doing so, spoiler warning, means sacrificing yourself, so that you change yourself to be able to heal the world, and that in doing so, you eventually, to be able to then heal the world, you have to basically sacrifice your life to continue. And so yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this worked out. Now, in terms of when I got to polishing phase, one of the big things that changed with this is because I have this end sequence. And the end sequence was one that the first time I did it, it was all manually keyed. So it was using basically just sort of manually triggering one thing after another. It would be trying to key off audio and visual changes, and also be keying off movement, and trying to do all of that and have it actually be a good detailed sequence was not easily doable. And the end sequence really was very lacking. That was one of the things, because I had a very clear picture in my head of what I wanted the end sequence to look like. And I wanted it to be this more dramatic moment. And at this point in time, when I was originally doing this, I had never made use of Timeline or Cinemachine. And those of you who have used Timeline or Cinemachine would realize that that final sequence, oh boy, doing that in using some Cinemachine cameras and also Timeline, oh, that's the way to go. And that's what I did in the polish phase. It took me actually less time to make a better end sequence than it did to make a terrible end sequence using other methods. The other thing I fixed in polish was those stairs, because oh boy, originally those stairs did not have nice collision. They were very jumpy, jagged stairs, and you would hit points where you would not be able to move if you took too close in a route. So that was one of the things I fixed in polish, was making them actually have a ramp, so it was less painful to move through it. And that definitely helped a lot. But yeah, I think the big thing, as I was mentioning with the timeline, and that's one of the big takeaways from this, and the big bits of advice I'd give anyone, is if you've got some kind of sequence there like that, making use of Cinemachine and Timeline. So I didn't really start doing that until quite late in the series of games. But the difference that it made was substantial. Because the original end sequence for this was, and I kind of wish I captured video footage of it so I could show you how garbage it was. Because it was really garbage. The camera was supposed to tilt up and follow the object, and that was not, it was not following the object well, and the whole sequencing was just, it was bad. But then this is what it has now came to. And so again, we've got the different prompt, which was the intentional thing, this idea that at the end of all of this, you're sacrificing yourself. And then we see the timeline version of this. It goes to a nice camera. We're animating the lighting moving up. We have this at a bit where it's pausing. Ceiling explodes out. Much, much more in line with what I was going for with it. So again, big things that I'd say from this that were my takeaways were, the planning worked really well in terms of planning out the levels. That planning them out on paper, on grid paper, perfect. I think if I had used Cinemachine and Timeline from the beginning, I would have had a bit more time to have more things there in the environment, to have more of this sense of, okay, this room serves this purpose, this room serves this other purpose. That's the big thing that was missing. There wasn't a purpose to the individual rooms, and I think going and revisiting this one, and it's one that I'm definitely considering revisiting and turning it into a larger game, I would be making that as a major sort of touchstone with it, is having there be a clear purpose for all of the rooms. What does this room serve in terms of purpose? What do these artifacts do? And making it all make sense. That's the big thing that was missing there. And I think that would have helped make this environment feel more of like a real place. At the moment it feels kind of off, which doesn't really quite fit. So then moving on from there to the next game. Okay, so on to the 8th game. So this one was a lot of fun. This one, this was working with the prompt of what do we do now. And I should point out, there's going to be a couple of spoilers for this one, so if you haven't played it, there is a little bit of a twist in it, and you might want to skip ahead if you don't want it spoiled for you. So this game, originally the ideas that I was playing with was the idea of your you're manufacturing things and you've run out of, you don't necessarily have all of the supplies that you need, and then you're just throwing whatever into it. You're throwing in your lunch, a thermos of coffee, all sorts of stuff. So sort of considering that as sort of the manufacturing side, was also then tossing around the idea of, well, you're a cleaner and you're having to clean this area, and you can actually do it sort of properly, or you can get there and you can just kind of throw stuff out the window or throw stuff into the manufacturing hoppers. And that's sort of what sort of formed the seed of then what actually came to be with the game. So the idea was you were going to be cleaning. And that's sort of what it came to, that you were going to be cleaning this environment, which meant that I got to make a dirt shader that I could apply onto things. That was a huge amount of fun. Making this dirt shader and seeing that work, such good fun. Then it came to how you were going to clean it. So I was going to do it where it's something that you were directly controlling something that made physical contact, and something like Viscera cleanup detail where you've got the mop. That's obviously, there's a whole lot of things needing to be done there. I really didn't want to try and do mop physics or the animations for that. So I wanted to keep it simpler. And I had this idea of sort of cleaning guns. And then it rapidly went from, well, it's becoming sort of more of a goofy, comedic toy of a game. So what if it's not just cleaning guns, but what if it's dual wielding cleaning guns? And that they can be overcharged and can just go ridiculous. And so, it starts out with the premise of, and this was where I first started using timeline for doing this sequence. It started out with the premise of, okay, so you're using these guns to be cleaning stuff, and you arrive here and you're told that there was a minor incident. And so what I wanted to have happen, and what I assume people would do, is because it's just, at the moment, all you know is that the room is dirty and you need to clean it. So people are naturally going to get there and be doing this, and this is obviously going to be really sort of slow, but then if they let them overheat, these go ridiculous. So I call them the Inferno bubbles in the project. The Inferno bubbles can penetrate objects, and just as a way to make it that it's easy to clean everything, they specifically have a greater penetration of clean objects. So they can penetrate objects. They also do much more cleaning. So they clean very rapidly. They have this sort of wider dispersion arc. And the other big thing though is they impart a huge amount of physics force. Like with these, I can hit stuff, it moves, if I'm careful, I can definitely clean this entire stack without going and knocking any of it over. So I could do that, but the goal, what I was pretty confident of from a player behavior point of view, was once players realized that when these overcharge, they clean really well, and you can just do this, and you can just carpet the entire area in cleaning bubbles, and you can make these hilarious, the most effective way to clean is to make these gigantic stacks in the corner and just absolutely go to town with the bubble gun. And so I wanted people to be doing that, and that was really the big thing with this, was that was a player behavior that I knew would be hilarious. And like the audio sound that these make is me making the sound, and that moment when I had the sound in, I lost my shit. Hearing it, especially when it goes into the overheat mode, I lost my shit, because it was just exactly the kind of goofy tone that I was wanting to go for with it. And it was a player behavior that was hilarious and was fun. This is never not going to be an enjoyable way to play the game. And so, because I set up the premise of, well, you arrive and you're told there's just been a minor incident, and you discover the room is just absolutely filthy. I wanted to, what that led to then was like, well, let's have the manufacturing thing still in there. So that was the thing, from fairly early on, the manufacturing, I still wanted it in there, but the idea was going to be, you have gone in and you've cleaned the room, and at this point you don't know there's a second stage where you can, where you have to actually do the manufacturing. So you're just going to default player behavior, get there and just go absolutely to town, making a gigantic mess of it. And then what's going to happen, and I'm gonna cheat a little bit and make this happen sooner by, let's check the time remaining, down to 5 seconds, because then you get to the end of this. I was like, cool, you're told that there was a minor incident, so then you have to fill out your end of shift report. And I wanted it to be all sort of bureaucratic, and you can't click any of the other options here other than that there was a minor incident, because I thought that would be a nice way of, like, people have come into this and like, we're told this was a minor incident and this room is messed up, and it's a nice way of them just, basically being fuck you to the person for saying that. And you're like, cool, I'll end my shift. You're like, okay, people are going to be thinking it starts over, but the dialogue is slightly different. And then this time around, you are having to do the manufacturing. So now you're having to, if you've gone ham, you're having to find the materials here, and you have to add in the right amount, because if you add in too much, that causes issues. If you put things into the wrong hopper, also causes issues. Now, if the room is really, you might think, well, okay, easy way, room really dirty, fine. If the room's really dirty, your character coughs. And the dirtier it is, the more they cough. And if you are standing here holding one and then you cough, it will by default go for the pour a large amount in there. If you are a bit away from it, what the coughing will do is it will cause you to drop it. So if you go really ham like this, you're then trying to actually make stuff when it's clearly going to be an issue, and it's keeping track of how wrong you get stuff. And these do have a capacity, so you can you do run out of the particular ones as well. And one of the things here is I wanted this escalation, so it has critical issues detected, and it progressively gets more and more severe, and eventually you get the status, which again, keeping sort of the comedic tone, was a status that I kind of couldn't not add into it. But if you keep putting in all of the wrong stuff, then you get this as the feedback of, well, what have you done? Which works. I'm really happy with how well that works. I don't think I added any further statuses beyond that. But yeah, kind of the big sort of takeaways from this one were knowing what bits to add and what bits to take away. Because I'd considered having a bit at the end where there's like an unveiling of the product and you see that. And I felt that wouldn't actually work, because it would be a case of essentially the same joke happening multiple times, not sort of any variation on it. I felt like it would be repetition that wouldn't be adding to the humor of it. And so what I ended up adding in Polish was actually just that initial screen where you get to the end of it and you're like, cool, I'm going to say that there was just a minor incident and you end the shift. Because that makes that impact of then arriving at the room again and having to actually work with what you've done much more impactful and much more just hilarious. And intentionally, with all the screenshots in that, I made the choice of making it that there's nothing that gives away that you're going to need to actually be working in this room after you've cleaned it. So intentionally, there's a lot of stuff with this of taking advantage of what I think the player's default behavior would be, and then making that not be punishing for them, but just hilarious. Because if you get this absolutely perfect, there's no reward. There is the status that you see here in terms of on track or what have you done. That's it in terms of the feedback that you get. There's no further feedback. There's no sort of win state. It's all about you just doing whatever. So yeah, it worked out really well. Using timeline for the intro and exit sequences worked quite nicely, and when I came back and polished, I actually embedded more timeline stuff into it just for some of the other sequences that were happening. But yeah, overall, this one worked really well, and I think the big takeaway from this was looking at what typical player behavior would be and deciding, having that play into the game. And that might be a case of where you're wanting to subvert the player behavior, or it might be a case of where you're wanting that typical player behavior to be rewarding. And so in this case, I knew those bubble guns, especially when they overheat, would be rewarding, and that players would try and min-max things and be like, the easiest way to clean stuff is to pile it in a corner and go to town. And so I wanted to, that leaning into that and making that the core mechanic and making that funny worked really well with it. And that sort of set a tone for some of the other ones as well, which we'll see with the next game. All right, over to the 9th game. So this one kept sort of some of that comedic tone from the previous one. And the interesting thing was this was using the prompt of Ritual, which was actually, that global game jam was the first one that I actually did. With that one made a dance battle game, competitive 2-player dance battle game. Also kind of a comedic tone, actually. So this one wanted it to be a comedic tone. I was trying to think of the kinds of things that you could do with that, and I wanted it to be some kind of magic ritual. So I wanted to use ritual in that sense. And I very much wanted it to be working with elements. Those were sort of the thoughts that was feeling like really good, strong touchstones for me, of it being something that was magic-based, something that was using elements. And so I didn't want it to just also be, that you're just casting spells. I wanted it to be for some purpose. And then the idea that I came to was the idea of, what if you took the central bureaucracy that you see in Futurama, but you made it wizards. And that's what the conceit for this is that you're dealing with a setup where you have bureaucratic wizards. And very, very, very bureaucratic, which is why it starts out with this, introductory letter that you get that's just referring to you by, number, and that it's referring to the incident, and that's why there's no, you don't have free-form spellcasting anymore. It's just using this device. And also the explanation is given of why the character can't really see. And that's because there was a mislabeled shipment of newt eyes and they applied them as eye drops. So you can't see particularly well. And that was sort of the intent here. And so the post-processing effects was using them fairly heavily. And so the board is also randomized. The rows stay consistent in terms of what type of thing is in each row. But in terms of the order within that row, it changes every time. So you can't just memorize the particular pattern. So I wanted that sort of side of you using these elements to cast spells. But then that gets really tricky, because I had 4 different elements, 4 different locations, 4 different types of actions, and that was one of the things was really working out in the design phase, was those types of actions. And I ended up settling on create and remove. Create and destroy were straightforward. And then I went for essentially shrink or enlarge as the other actions. So then I had my elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And then I needed to locate, sort of working out, okay, well that gave me 2, and I thought I could have a row that's scale. So I've got a scale row. That also had an advantage in terms of somewhat constraining the design to be a bit more of a manageable problem. And then it was working out what I wanted for that 4th row, and I ended up settling on location. So locations end up being the ground, the sky, the lake, or people's homes. Now with that, that's 4 different actions, 4 different elements, 4 different locations, 4 different scales. Which, if I had it be very unique for each one, that would end up being 256 combinations. A little bit out of scope. Now with the scale, that simplified things immediately, because the scale meant that, okay, really I've got 64 different things and they can be applied at different intensities. So that helped make it a bit more manageable. And then I started to constrain it based upon the location. And so what I did in my planning is I actually mapped it out. All of the combinations in the table and working out. And so one of the things I was looking at here was ones where nothing would happen, and keeping a track of the percentage of those. Because a big thing there is I wanted to make sure that most of the combinations you pick, something happens. Now there are a bunch of ones where things won't happen, and the final percentage actually ended up being better than this, because there's a couple of bits here that I didn't update from memory. Yes, because adding air to the sky increases the wind. So I mapped out all those combinations. That was one of the first things I did to get a sense of what were the different effects that I need to create. That allowed me to then categorize them. So I ended up setting up this system where you have spell receivers. And the spell receivers there's like a generic set of ones. So for things like fire and water, there could be generic ones that would just spawn clusters of them. But then the lake could say, nope, if you're spawning water, I want to do something different. And the sky could say, if we're spawning air, I want to do this other thing. So having that set up of a base spell receiver that could do a bunch of the core logic, and then having specializations based on each location, which could then specialize on element, that made it much easier. That meant that a lot of what I was implementing was very manageable. And so, okay, I had it at the point where I could create all of these things. And so I could, can pick a combination of ones, and I could make it that the areas would change, but then there had to be a purpose for all of this. And so what I came up with was that you would have these quests. And I made the quests so that they're actually randomly generated, but there's a set of different ones that it picks from. And some of the quests can be linked. So things like the water spouts, if it picks one of the ones for town or people, it's linked to the other one, so you'll always get both. So you might be lucky and you might get 3 quests, or you might get 5 quests. Possibly even more actually if it picked the rock ones as well. So you could get up to 6. So it would do all of these different quests, and the quests themselves would keep track of whether what the quest did was they would instacast a spell to begin with. So in this case, the Earth Remove one initially casts Create Earth and a huge amount of it on the ground. So the spell, the quests actually set the initial state of the environment, and then it had conditions that it was able to check. So that meant that I was able to easily set up and add in a lot of these quests, meant I could easily drive this UI, and that worked really nicely for it. So the whole process there of having it data-driven and of planning out, and that was the big thing I would say as a takeaway from this, was that process of planning out what are all of my interactions, what do they look like, how do they behave with each other. Mapping out all of that made a huge difference to this, because it meant that I could identify the commonalities, and that then I could work out how to structure the code really effectively. So as I said early on, I learned my lesson of not planning. This one wasn't just a case of planning, but it was also a case of planning the right things first. And that core system of those elemental interactions, because that was like going into this, there's 256 interactions was terrifying. Once it scaled down, it's like, actually there's 64 with a scale, and actually there's a lot of overlap with a bunch of these, so it's really more like sort of, 16 to 30 unique things that I was needing to set up. That made it a lot more manageable. In terms of the VO for these, so it is Latin, because I wanted something that sounded a bit more magical, and Latin worked. I did take a bit of creative license with what words it was using. I did try and check, the reverse translations of them, but some of the words, the actual one, really didn't sound very good. And it didn't sound wizardy enough. So I used some of the ones that had slightly different meaning, but still roughly in the same wheelhouse, to actually create the sort of particular vocal effect that I was wanting with it. And that actually worked out quite well. Did mess around with some stuff of reversing it and things like that, but really it ended up working best just with The Latin with a bit of things like reverb and volume added on it, and the last row in particular, that's always said with more intensity. And yeah, that side worked out quite well. So yeah, big takeaways I'd say from this. Planning early, in particular, planning your interactions and how they play out makes a huge difference. That allowed me to have time to do things like, well, you can put out fires by flooding the town. That worked out sort of quite well. Having those interactions made it interesting and made it a bit more compelling. So planning those out early really be the big thing that I would say was a good takeaway from this. Okay, so we're now at the 10th game, and this one was an interesting one. This one had the prompt of waves, and again, it was a game jam that I'd done the global game jam for this before, and I kept trying to toss around different ideas, and the thing that kept sort of sticking for me was this idea of being able to shatter things with sound waves. You hit that resonant frequency of things, then they shatter. And so, I wanted that. I wanted that aspect of being able to shatter things, and I wanted to be able to give the player control over what that music sort of sounded like. And that's what ultimately led to this setup. So what I wanted something that was accessible. That was a key thing. So yeah, I could easily have set up something that would make my sense to people that have a background in music. But I wanted one that people using it, they didn't need to have that musical background. And so that meant I needed to strip things back. So what I reduced it to was the key things of being able to control the pacing, the tempo of the music. And my idea was being able to draw all of these. So tempo of the music was one. And then because I wanted this idea of hitting the right frequencies, then you can control the intensity in each frequency. So then that meant that it was something that someone didn't need to have a musical knowledge to understand. Okay, let's make it more intense, in this frequency band, and then let's make it less intense in this one, or in the case of this one, let's make it start off low and go high. So that was sort of the stuff that was quite straightforward for someone to be able to understand. So now with this was one that obviously had a big tech risk here with it, in that what I was needing to do was not just be affecting the audio, but have the audio actually feed into the gameplay. So as you manipulated the audio, that in turn had to change the gameplay, because what I was having for the objects was that you have to provide them a certain amount of energy within a certain frequency range. And so it meant I needed to read a lot of info back from the audio engine, and so for this I'm using WIs, which I've used it on all of the projects and I've used it for decades now. Huge fan of it, and I was pretty sure it would be able to be done. And so I set up a test scene to begin with that just had music playing, and I found a great piece from Kevin MacLeod that I was able to use. And so I had the music playing and just checked that I could read the data back, and then also check that I could adjust the speed of the music, and that I could adjust the intensity and read it back. And all of that actually worked far more readily and far better than I really had any right to expect it to. It worked perfectly. The only things I ran into were changing the intensity here in these bands. So that didn't change what I would get back from WIs. Although I was adjusting the intensity of the stuff there in it, I was always getting back the same value. Now that was not a huge issue, because it still corresponded to something that was consistent across the song, and what I was able to do was take these indications the player had provided, and it actually turns these into an animation curve. So each band here gets turned into its own animation curve, so then when I'm reading back the intensity of the music at that point in time, I can just look up that time index in that curve and then scale the value I get back based upon that. So that worked out in terms of being able to have it output energy, have it the player be able to affect it. And then the challenge then was making this actually, like, there was a lot of balancing of, I wanted it so that something would always be generally breaking the first time for the player, and I like this idea of having the stuff scroll up the top and all these effects. So the very first time I wanted the player to have some stuff explode, but not everything. So the different things in the environment, what I set up with my shatter system is each one has its own config, and you can configure how much it costs, the force that it shatters with. So when something shatters, it can hit something else, and that in turn can cause that to shatter. So I was able to set up how it sort of behaved, and then I was able to give things a different resonance config. So a lot of the stuff you see in the environment is shatterable. The chandelier and the conductomatic are both destructible. But whereas something like the glass jug takes 200 energy, and that can vary by plus or minus 50, and it only has one band for it, that's that item. If we look at the actual chandelier has multiple bands. So what that means is that in the first case, you need to pump out 800 units, plus or minus 100 of energy, into 2 randomly chosen bands. Then once you've done that, that unlocks the next tier. And if you manage to get that, then that will cause the chandelier to smash. Conductomatic is even harder to actually do, and because it's randomly rolled every time, there's a chance that you'll manage to do this by accident, but it's going to be tricky. And you're actually always working against time, because as you destroy things, the party that's going on outside gets basically key to the value of what you destroy. So the more of a value you destroy, then the sooner they will break in, which means if you manage to hit really, really perfectly in terms of like that and getting lots and lots of glasses, that's going to massively shorten the time window for being able to actually essentially be game over for it. But this one was a huge challenge, because I didn't, intuitively it actually makes sense, but I didn't realize it at the time, is by playing things at a slower tempo, it's putting out a lot more energy in terms of it's putting it out over a longer time period. So going a really slow tempo, you could go a very slow tempo and quite a low intensity, and that will actually put out a huge amount of energy. And so that's where I needed some mechanic to restrain that. And what I came up with was the overheating one. So when it overheats, it puts out significantly less energy. So that's something that works as a sort of tempering there on it. So it avoids the player being able to just play the song at a low intensity, really slowly, and have it just wreck everything. It sort of works as a nice counterbalance. So this one, a really big thing, I guess, was a lesson that learnt well with this, was just, and I've done this with all of the games, but this one it paid off in particular very heavily, was driving stuff via just scriptable objects. So every single item that is destructible, the scriptable object configures everything for it. It configures the WISE event, it configures the particles that get played, also changes its shatter mode. So I was able to customize the shatter mode. So lights use one particular mode, whereas a glass just explodes. And the chandelier has its own very chandelier explosion, because the chandelier, and I think I still have my debug stuff in for it, because if we look at what happens when I destroy the chandelier, I hope I've still got my debug stuff in it, because yes, I do have the force shatter option. Let's turn off the gizmos. So the chandelier, I wanted it to be, if you managed to get the chandelier to break, that you got appropriately rewarded for it. So if I force the chandelier to break, it does a colossal explosion that manages to take out a lot of stuff. You can also, as I said, explode the conductomatic as well, which when you do that, it isn't game over. So it isn't game over but it's then permanently overheated. So it now will be stuck in overheat mode for the entirety of the game. I think at this point I've pretty much destroyed all of the things. Oh no, this table did pretty well. It still survived. But yeah, the big takeaway I would say with this was just really being able to have everything data driven and being able to just debug things and forcibly shatter stuff. It made a huge difference in terms of the speed of iteration and just in balancing things. Because I had so many different things that relied on it, this setup really paid off. So that'd be a big thing that I'd recommend is the tech test I did to begin with. So setting up my little level just to be able to test. So I had one for particles as well. That I used as just my level for building all of the particles in it, and then I did similar with the shatter system and that of just being able to be able to be testing with that. So having those little test levels, doing those tests of sort of your big tech risks, massive payoff, and then using data to drive a lot of the projects really paid off a huge amount in terms of with this one as well. So let's take a look now at the second last one. Alright, so we're over to the 11th game, the second last one. So this is the prompt of transmission. So this one was, again, going through a lot of ideas for this one, and really what I wanted this to be was you're sort of isolated for whatever reason and you're trying to communicate with others. And so I toyed around with some ideas. It was always sort of around a post-apocalyptic setting, and was considering stuff like exploring, a friendship being communicated just through computer terminals between characters over sort of time during this post-apocalyptic environment. So I was considering that, but was never really sort of locking in as a solid idea. And also, huge challenge there in creating a narrative that's actually, engaging and compelling and has a good arc. So really wasn't certain I'd be able to actually deliver on that to the level that I'd be happy with. But I like this idea of communicating through a computer terminal, and so it ended up being, from that it sort of evolved to, okay, well, I'm in this bunker, and one of the things I'm going to be able to do is at night be able to communicate. It's like, okay, so I'm doing it at night, but what am I doing the rest of the time? So I wanted to set it up then as this bit of this survival situation. So, you have the basics here for survival in terms of we've got a system that can generate water and can filter it, and we've got these plants that, in theory are growing. Slight spoiler, they will never actually be useful. All they do is consume water. That's all they do, nothing else. But you have to manually filter water, and you have this calendar that gives you a sense of sort of where you're at. You can periodically eat food. In the first version I made of this, so one of the things that was added in polish was this whole area. Because after I built it, I then realized this is some kind of shelter where people are meant to survive for an extended period, and they've been given nowhere to shower, but more importantly, nowhere to go to the toilet. Slightly essential. So this was a bit of a risky one, not in terms of sort of the systems. I mean, the systems are a little bit tricky in that there's a lot of things that consume water, in particular is the trickiest resource. Food was a more straightforward one. Water was the really tricky one. There's unfiltered and filtered water. Both of these tanks also have a leak. And so if you're not filtering water, things get bad quickly. But so those who are using water, you can drink. So you can drink water up to a point. You can water these plants periodically. And you've got things like the shower and the toilet consuming water. And so balancing that was actually tricky. So what I ended up going with, because I knew that if I just had it be, if it proceeded linearly in time, that was going to be tricky in that someone could always go and skip eating or drinking. Now I could set up systems that force them to do that, but that didn't really feel like it fitted. So kind of what I wanted was, because I feel like if you're in this setup where you're trapped, it's this post-apocalyptic world, you're trapped, you're isolated, your sense of time is going to go wonky. And I feel like time's going to get a little bit slippery. And so you'll jump ahead at times. And so that's what actually happens. You skip ahead at times, multiple days. So every time you sleep, you'll move 2 to 3 days ahead. So what that let me do is that based upon the number of days that it moves ahead, a lot of these things actually will do a fixed consumption no matter what. So these plants always use an amount, whether you use the filter or not. The shower and the toilet are the same. You will always drink and eat no matter what. The amount just takes into account whether you ate or drank that day. The only thing that you actually have agency over is the purifying of the water. That will not happen automatically, but everything else does. And so that made it a bit more manageable for balancing it, because otherwise balancing it was going to be tricky. So that let me balance how things work during the day and let me manage the sort of skipping ahead, and it kind of fitted in with this idea that the person's losing track of their sense of time a bit. And then the terminal. Now this was a big risk in that 100% of the story is pretty much, you basically, it's all through this. And so this was repurposing my developer console add-on. And I think this needed more work. This is an area that if I was going to go back and do updates, and I likely will, I'd do more on this to guide people to making use of the computer and to realizing that it's there and being able to access it, because more of these journals appear over time, and that's something that wanted to be able to sort of have happening there. And the content of these journals actually changes. So if you have gone and not eaten or not drank, or if they were all fully out, that actually factors into the stuff that gets said. So if people don't engage with this, or if they really sort of bounce off of the engagement with it, which there's areas that needs to be improved with it to make it be, at the moment it's a bit too janky for engaging with it, because like now I can't engage with it until the next night, and that's not great. It's supposed to have that, but only when you tell it to do the radio scan. And this thing, there's a lot of info in this one thing, but it's not creating as great an experience as I would like. And so what's also just kicked in there is I didn't want people staying awake. So if they try to stay awake, it eventually forcibly makes them sleep. But essentially you're trapped in here. It's a post-apocalyptic environment. There's no zombies. It's a world where the climate change has not been addressed, and much of the world has become uninhabitable, and you essentially have these fortified cities where the rich and elite live, and the rest of the world is forced to try and eke out an existence in what remains of civilization, because they're not welcome in those fortified cities, and if they try and get there, then they get killed, basically. So it's quite a dark setup, and the lighting sort of really fades into like it's a very, very harsh and dark looking sort of sunset that's clearly sort of happening there. So a bunch of things worked really well with this. The systems, again, doing these sort of style of UIs worked really well. I was repurposing some earlier stuff. The way I managed balancing the systems was really happy with. Having that forced usage for most things meant that balancing that was a lot easier. The big thing that didn't work well that really needs improving is this console. There needs to be more driving people to using it, and it needs to be more usable. At the moment, it's a little bit, more than a little bit, it's user unfriendly, so it means people bounce off of it, which means if people aren't prepared to be more patient than I think they need to be, they're not going to get the narrative and the story of what's happening and see the desperation creeping in for this person as they get closer and closer towards, running out of the food and the water and hoping for rescue. And so that's something that, coming back to this, there'll be improvements that I'll make to the console to really, really sort of make it user-friendly, draw people's attention to it. Because at the moment people miss out on the narrative, and this is one of the ones that I'm most happy with the narrative in, so it's quite a shame that happens. And that's pretty much it for this game. So let's take a look at the final game. Okay, so we're off to the last game. So this was an interesting one, because this was the "What Home Means to You" prompt. And this was obviously one I was making around Christmas time. So there was a lot of consideration with this of trying to work out, I was trying to think of what do I actually want this one to be. And the ideation on this one was actually tricky. Because it was definitely, there's a lot, home was something that was used as a prompt in one of the subjects teach for games. So I've seen a lot of games made with this home prompt. Obviously this is a game jam I did, and I've seen all the other ones that were produced with that sort of prompt. Well, not all of them, a lot of them. And so that made this one a challenge of working out, well, what do I want to do for a home game? And, I kind of interpreted the stuff a little bit liberally, but for me, home should be a place that feels safe, and should feel safe, protected, and so I had this idea of from that it became sort of tower defense game. I was like, okay, well, what are you wanting to be defending against? And I mean, obviously with it being Christmas time, I kind of ended up going for being a Christmas themed one, and so I like the idea of it being a gingerbread house. And one of the early things I did with this, and this was again testing that sort of tech and making it work, was tested making this house that could be collapsible. And so that sections of it would have health and could be destroyed, and that worked out quite nicely. So, I knew that from that point of view with the tech, was pretty happy with it. But then, in terms of what I wanted for attacking you, I wanted it to be Christmas-themed things. So in this case, didn't want it to be a case of, well, you're shooting Santa. That's just mean. Didn't want that. I thought, well, okay, snowmen are a good sort of option, in part because that was within the realm of what I was confident I could actually model and animate, because it didn't need much beyond some spheres and a little bit of colouring. So I was pretty happy with that. Then it was a case like, okay, I've got these snowmen, and with having the snowmen, it's like, okay, what do I want with my weapons? And so I was keeping a little bit with the theme of the sort of wacky, comedic stuff from earlier ones. And so I decided that the weapons should be things like, I guess kind of Christmas beverages, or at least ones that would be good in winter. So that's why you get the hot chocolate. And messed around with this to get the sort of arc and everything right for it feeling reasonable. Because it's not supposed to be a brutally challenging game. And the alternate fire originally wasn't part of the plan. It actually just happened because I was doing the setup for it, and it was so little effort for me to have support for having the alternate fire that it kind of seemed silly to not have it, because it was a case of I'm just checking for a different key press. I was using scriptable objects and driving the what was happening from data anyway. So it was really just slightly different data. So I went with that. So I ended up with the alternate fire, and the alternate fire does the big sort of cluster versions, and they also do have slightly different properties. And the cluster version ones will do often a little bit less damage, but they also actually have status effects. Now that's something that's, and then I've got a new weapon. That's something that's not actually particularly readable. The alternate fires do have a status effect on them. And some of the weapons also have, like the primary fires also have status effects. So like the hot chocolate, the alternate one of that does a burn, slow burn effect, because it's a chili hot chocolate. The brandy custard one, that does a bit of a slow because custard. And then the final one with the mulled wine does slow plus also burning. And so that had that worked well with the weapons, and with the enemies. I was running short on time because there's a bunch of things that were really tricky, because I had to have the AI behaviors, and there's some squad level behaviors as well as some individual ones. And so there's a lot that I need to make work there. And so I was running short on time, which is why the snowmen, essentially the variation with them is some of them have top hats and some of them don't. Some of them are tall, some of them are short. And then there are the boss ones which glow. And so I set up all of these waves. That was sort of working nicely. These are the mini ones. I didn't get a lot of time to customize the waves, in particular with the final polishing phase. There was a lot of bugs that I was running into that I don't know how I missed them earlier. That meant that I was needing to sort them, and so I didn't really get to tune the damage level for these. Now obviously with this, because you're up on top of the house, that meant that if you were, they get through, you're not going to be able to stop them. So what happens is they get crushed by, the conceit is they get crushed by the building section. So it means that it is punishing if one gets through. If even one gets through, you're toast. It will destroy that foundation, and then it's just a matter of time. And the house can get completely divided, so you could have one section over here, and then another section over here that's connected, and nothing else. So you eventually always lose, because over time they scale up in health, they scale up in damage and everything as well. So you will always be defeated. But yeah, I think the big success with this one was, again, leveraging off of some of the lessons from the earlier ones and data driving stuff. So everything in this is data driven. The actual materials in terms of the weapons, all of those are data driven, their behaviors, and these can chain together to any depth, which meant I could have cluster ones that would launch other clusters, applying effects like slow, everything like that, all just able to be added by changing the data. So we can see the brandy custard one, it doesn't do any status effects for the secondary fire, because the little clusters that form aren't a secondary one, but their primary one, they do slow, and they do a slow burn. So data driving for that worked really well. The characters are also very data driven, so it meant if I want to rebalance the damage of ones, was straightforward. Customizing what ones would appear, also straightforward. So I think the big successes from this were really that heavy data driving of everything. Made a huge difference. I think the area that I would most want to make improvements on, because I think it is the weakest sort of area, is really in terms of the balancing and the wave composition. That was an area that I didn't get enough time because I ran into bugs, and I didn't really allow for didn't allow the time for properly balancing these waves. They're okay. They're not amazing, and I think there is definitely room for them being more balanced. I think also if I was going back and adding more stuff to this, one of the big things I'd want to do there is have a level of upgrades. Because the intent was always going to be that there would be stuff at the base of the home that would be doing slow damage to the snowman. And I think if it had that in, that would have sort of helped out a little bit as well. But yeah, big pluses in terms of the data driving, but improvement really needed there with the balancing of the waves. And that's the last game. So that's the full set of all the games, and I've talked for a lot longer than I expected. I've taken a few breaks. You'll sort of be able to tell the points I was editing because it's actually quite hot today, and I don't have aircon in this room, so I was taking breaks to turn on the fan or to retreat to a room that had air conditioning because it's very hot. But yeah, I hope the video's been useful and informative. I think if I was going to give any sort of recommendations taking away from this, big thing was obviously planning. Make sure, planning out in detail all of the stuff that needs to be done. So I would plan out all of the tasks. I'd estimate times for them, and then I would, every few hours, or if a task took significantly under or over its time, I'd go and then update that plan. So it'd be put together a plan and then reassess it periodically, or if something changes significantly. That worked really well for keeping me on track. The other things I'd recommend is, putting your biggest risks first. So if it's a tech risk, if it's a design or art or technical programming risk, do those first. Do a test scene, make sure they work. Because once you're confident that those work, and in particular, not just that they work, but how they work, then you can build things up around them. And that made a huge, huge difference for the ones where I was really needing that and ones where I did that. The other sort of advice that I'd give there in terms of tools to be making use of is things like Cinemachine and Timeline were godsends. Once I started actually using them significantly, which was in the last sort of 3 to 4 projects, the difference that made in terms of where I was spending my time was phenomenal. It meant that I was able to be very quickly putting together sequences that, ending sequences, things like that played out how I wanted, and it meant that I was spending my time in other areas that would, the player would get more benefit from. And so using tools like that were a huge benefit. From a general production tool point of view, using Butler for uploading builds to itch.io, huge time saver as well. It meant that the uploads were much smaller. It meant that I wasn't having to do a lot of messing around with, okay, now I can make sure it's have to be named this way and upload this. It's like I ran a batch file that I put together, and it was largely the same one for each project, and it just uploaded them. And it was a smaller upload, so it meant my iteration times were faster. Faster iteration times is better. It meant that if I found a bug, I could fix it, push up a new build, download that, and then test it. And it's really helped with that iteration time. And then I think one of the final bits of advice, the two sort of things I would say is, in your game, think about what the player's typical behavior is going to be, and then make a call on whether it's going to be best to lean into that, to make it that you're rewarding and taking full use of that behavior, or if it's something that you actually want them to be doing the opposite. And then look at how you want to guide that. Like if in whatever happened to the survey team 4, people are going to want to go off the track. That's going to be human nature, is to do that. And so I made that more punishing, but did that in a fairly subtle way of making the daytime, the safe period, shorter, and the nighttime, the danger period, longer. Worked as in a natural thing that the player's likely not going to then hit into those world boundaries. Whereas then, if we take the example of one minor incident, player behavior there was going to be, I can knock physics objects around and it's going to be funny. Players are going to do that, so let them do that, make that fun and satisfying to do that, and then make it funny for when they hit that moment of, oh great, now I need to work with this mess that I've made. So leaning into the player behaviors and things like that can create a really compelling experience. And then sometimes you want to go the opposite, because in games so often, almost always, the player is active, they're doing something, they have agency and they're making use of that agency. So then in We're With You, that specifically was, I wanted the player to do nothing. And that was the way to succeed, to do nothing and to starve Ouroboros. And that's something you absolutely, I don't think it's something that's going to be a hugely common mechanic to incorporate into things, but I think used carefully and used well and balanced carefully. There's that right point between frustration and being sort of compelling and interesting. And I think having a bit of cueing along the way so the player felt like something was happening, that their inaction was actually having an effect. That made a big difference, I think, as well. So those are the key sort of things I'd recommend sort of taking away from planning. Doing your tech risks early, with a tech asset, design, whatever the risk area is, doing those early. Looking at and thinking about what your player behavior is going to be, and then making use of tools like your Cinemachine, your Timeline, Butler to save time. Those make a huge difference and allow you to spend the time where it matters most. And the other sort of final bit would be, if you feel like you're having to force an idea, if you can't picture it in your head, if you feel like the gameplay is not interesting or compelling in your head, if you don't find yourself continually thinking about it, start looking at other ideas. Don't try and force an idea and force the execution of that. So it's often a sign that the idea is not fully working, you need to think of other options. That would be my big sort of suggestions for everyone. And I hope you've enjoyed the games, and I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you want to check out the games, then I've got a link to them in the subject line below. Until next time, bye.